Always the boy that catches the fish and brings them home to Liza. Oh, hello there, me old trout. Sure, 'tis Writing Wednesday, and I think it's time for us to have a bit of a chinwag about the interesting question of stereotypes. Now, for you, those of you who writes that, you know, that science fiction or them fantasy stories, this might not be so relevant. It's more a question for people who writes like the realistic fiction set in a particular place and time, because when you want your fiction to be grounded into realities of the place where it's set, you don't want it to slide into stereotypes. Or do ya? Certainly a big question that a lot of Newfoundland writers face, but I'm sure it is faced by people from the American South and the north of England and probably places all over the world. How do you accurately reflect the place where you comes from by the Lord Thunder and Dying without sliding into caricature? I have to say that was about the hardest 45 seconds of speaking I've ever done in all of this video series, because a lot of the Newfoundland stereotypes don't come really natural to me. As a born and bred Newfoundlander, you know, I've lived in St. John's all my life. I don't normally speak with a very distinct Newfoundland accent. I have never set foot on a fishing boat. I don't drink. So there's a lot of Newfoundland stereotypes, a lot of things that supposedly are typically Newfoundland that don't apply to me, and yet I consider myself a very, very proud Newfoundlander. So how do I reflect the reality of that in my fiction? I think all of us who are to some degree regional writers would like our writing to accurately echo a place and give a strong sense of place, and yet avoid that slide into caricature, but that's not always easy. There's also the question that people have different opinions of what is and isn't stereotypical. For example, I can think of a particular local writer who wrote a story that some people were praising as, wow, this is amazing, gritty realism, this is something we don't read about, this is a side of Newfoundland we never see. And when I picked up the book and read it, I was just like, this is every stereotype of working class Irish Catholic downtown St. John's that I have ever heard. It's a complete stereotype. So we don't always even necessarily agree on what is or what isn't a stereotype, yet I think we all recognize that for characters to be real and true and human and not just cartoons, they need to be more complex than a stereotype. Sometimes that means understanding a bit about the complexities of the culture. So for example, while I find it great to use a bit of Newfoundland dialect in my writing where appropriate, in this latest book, A Southern Sun, where nearly all the characters are middle and upper class educated St. John's people, none of them would have spoken with what we think of as a typical Newfoundland accent, and in many ways, culturally, they probably thought of themselves as more English than Newfoundlanders at that time period. I ran across a really good suggestion about this from a friend when I was writing an outsider's view about a character from another culture, because my characters, who were from here in a particular story that you haven't read because it hasn't been published, were traveling in the American South, ran into a young woman who was, you know, kind of typical of what I think of as sort of, you know, Southern, poor, single mom, maybe kind of white trash, and she had a lot of very typical stuff going on. And my friend who read the manuscript said, you know, you were trying to make her typical, but you've kind of made her stereotypical. Give her something you wouldn't expect for that character. Instead of reading, you know, romance novels, make her read hardcore, gritty, blood and guts mysteries. And I really liked that, because people are so complex and places are all so complex, and our depiction of people has to get so much more layered. So your character may do something that's very stereotypical for a fisherman in a Newfoundland outport or whatever, but then they may have another side to them that doesn't fit what we expect of the stereotype. You know, I started out by saying that this doesn't really apply to the people who are writing science fiction and fantasy, but I think it really applies even there, because even in those genres, admittedly, you don't have the regional stereotypes because you probably invented all the regions yourself, but you still have the tropes, the archetypal characters, and you have to go beyond, I think, the caricature to even make those real and complex and multi-layered. So if your wise old wizard is basically just Gandalf in a different colored robe and hat, then you haven't really created a rounded character. One place where I think this is done so well is in the Star Trek series. And I mean, sometimes their writing and characterization, especially in the original series, is quite thin. But if you put all the series together, episode after episode, and take them at their best, it does become very layered and nuanced. So for example, beginning with Spock in the original series and continuing on with characters like Data in Next Generation and Seven of Nine in Voyager, you have this kind of trope of the not quite human character who, for one reason or another, is emotionless and purely logical and looks with a certain degree of incomprehension and maybe even contempt at human beings and how they're ruled by their emotions. And yet each of those characters throughout the run of their series developed a level of depth and complexity that belied that original idea of an emotionless robot. Even Data, who literally was an emotionless robot. And it's because of that kind of layered richness and complexity that when Spock, at the end of the original and real Wrath of Khan, says to Kirk, "You are and have always been my friend. Live long and prosper." I mean, if you've got your emotion chip installed, you cry at that point, and you cry because Spock has both fulfilled and transcended the stereotype of the emotionless alien. So, boys, with that reference to Mr. Spock in Star Trek, I think we're after sailing as far out on the waters away from our original topic of Newfoundland stereotypes as we can possibly go. All I want you to remember is that people be's awful complex and multi-layered, right? And that your writing should reflect that if you want your characters to be more than mere stereotypes. And with that said, until I see you next week for another Writing Wednesday, long may your big jib draw.